Now that we understand how the process works, let's go back and review how to set up Allocator to accomplish the things we just reviewed. So we'll need to create a rate type definition as well as a rate table. We also need to maintain our rates in multi-level rate entry. There's also a setup we need to do in project maintenance. We'll also discuss the option of running auto allocation, and we'll also discuss the process of indirect rate calculator. There are quite a few screens that go into creating the allocation process. We talked about the second item on the list where it says alloc method setup. We will also discuss the rate type definition, the allocation key definition, the rate table, and then multi-level rate entry. Multi-level rate entry is the screen where the screen that users primarily maintain and edit information in. So we'll spend some time on that. So all of these screens come together, and allocation processor reviews and calls on them and determines how to create your records. And then you'll get GL postings and project postings as well. Back to the allocation method setup, so we'll use this as our roadmap to then reference back to each one of the key components on how they combine and communicate to work together. So here we have a rate type of L, and that rate type is, if I hit F3, I'll see I have a list that's available. Now this is one of the instances where it says code type of rate that does not apply. It has its own setup table. We do not set it up in code file maintenance, but rather we go to rate type definition, and here is where we define those rates. Very simple. It doesn't have to be complicated. It's a 2-digit field, and we can determine these kind of rates. Now, related to rates that we might consider setting up, we're typically will have labor rates, we can have expense rates, we can have fringe rates. So typically I would put in FB for a fringe, or if you have multiple pools, maybe you have 3 fringe pools, we might use F1, F2, and F3 to designate 3 different fringe pools. We can have overhead, OH, or we might have, if we have more than one pool, O1, O2. And we also have G&A as well. So we typically will have the indirect rates that we'd set up a rate type for. We have labor rates. We also would have expense type rates. We could have fee rates as well. So in this instance, we have F for fee. We have S for subcontractor, but we're actually going to use subcontractor rates under labor instead of having a separate set of subcontract rates. And then we'll also have expenses. See here we have burden as another option, G&A. Those are used in the cost plus allocation method. So once we have our rates set up, we need to be able to reference those rates. And the rates are just a way for us to identify what rate table we're going to use. So if I come over to multi-level rate entry, which is the screen you will primarily enter data in, I have multiple rate tables. I have a time and materials rate table that we'll use to review. So when I pull up my time and materials rate table, you'll see that I have rates set up for labor, and I also have expenses, and I have some other ones, but these two, we're going to use labor rates and expense rates. So let's see how we've set up our rates. How it works is as it looks for the proper rate, it looks for the hierarchy within the setup that you have. So here I have 3 different table or rate levels. I have an employee rate level, a project and a labor class rate level, and this just a labor class. So if I have a unique billing rate for an employee, so again, back to my allocation method setup, we're taking the rate times the units that we find. So the rate that you set up is based on the rate that you would multiply by the units if you were doing this manually. So this employee has a unique set of rates regardless of the project they work on or regardless of the labor class. This is the billing rate for this employee. And conversely, these are the billing rates for these employees. So Allocator when Allocator runs, it goes through each level of steps. So it'll start in level 1. If it finds a rate that applies to the transaction it has, it will stop and take that rate. If it doesn't find it, it will go to the next level and see if a rate applies there. If it doesn't find a rate, it continues through. So we can have up to 9 levels of rates. And if it doesn't find a rate, it will go to the default level. So on level 1 here, we're going to look and it'll find if my transaction is not for employee E1182. So if we go back to our transaction detail inquiry, so this is where we can start seeing all these components we've looked at up until this point come together to help us understand and learn how to review our data. So this is our transactions that we started with. And I had I'm going to pull up labor only, just so we're limited to my labor. Oh, I can type. Okay, so I had Zoe Clark, 40 hours. So when it's looking through the rate tables, it's identifying who is Zoe Clark. Well, Zoe Clark is not EO11. In fact, Zoe's, if I come over to project time and expense and I look up who Zoe Clark is, she is Z00001. So this is her employee ID. And so when it's going through the multi-level rate entry, it's looking and says, is Z0001 in this list? No, it's not. So none of these rates apply to the transaction that I have. So now it proceeds on to the next level. Now it's looking specifically for a project and a labor class. And if it finds a rate that applies to the same project and labor class that my record is, then it will use that rate. So let's go back to our transaction detail inquiry and see if we can find, so it's employee Zoe Clark, and it's project CO0011, so that's the project I have. And let's see if we can find the labor class that she charged to. So here's my labor class, ARCH. So this is the labor class. So if it finds a record for project CO11 and labor class ARC, then that is the rate that it will take. So let's go find and see if there's a rate set up for that. So project CO11 and then labor class ARC. Now the last thing it does is look at the effective rate. So it compares the effective rate here to the transaction date of your record. So my transaction date on my record is 1/17/98. So that is well within. If this had been 1/1/2000, then this record would not apply because it's before the effective date. But since it's after the effective date, this $100 rate applies, and that's why it multiplied her 40 hours times $100. Let's take the same, so we can take these same concepts across all our transactions. So we can identify the same record for the subcontracts, the materials, and the travel. The only difference will be what's the criteria it's looking for. Is it looking for an employee rate? Is it looking for a labor class rate? Is it looking for an account category rate? So we'll go through each one of these and see how these rates vary. So my other transaction was subcontract. And here we had 10 hours at $600 and no employee. So let's look for the allocation method setup. So for subcontracts, we're using the same exact rate type of L. Again, we're looking for units. So we're taking whatever units we have times whatever rate we find that applies to the labor rate type, and it will multiply it by those units. So let's go back to multi-level rate entry. So we're still in T&M, and the rate type is L, so it still applies. Now the project, we already know is CO11, and the employee it's not an employee. So the fact that there was no employee with my subcontractor means it will skip all of these because the employee was not associated with it. Now I'm going to look again for a project and labor class combination. So let me go back to my transaction and identify. So I have no employee, so it'll skip that. And then let's identify the labor class. There it is, CONS. So if I go back to my multi-level rate entry, I do have a line for CO11, and this is a consultant. It's an outside subcontractor that's a consultant, so their labor rate is $75 an hour. Again, it will compare it to my transaction date. My transaction date is after 1/1/97, so then it takes the 10 hours that it finds times the $75 rate, and that's how it posts that rate. Okay, so now let's look at my materials. So on the allocation method for my materials, it's a little different, right? I have look for materials and find the amount of the materials and multiply it by the rate type of the rate you find under rate type X. So my materials, let's see what rate type X even offers for me under multi-level rate entry. So I was under my labor rates. Now I'm going to my expense rates. And before I move on to there, let's go back. If it didn't find the project and labor class, it would have continued on to the next level, which is labor class. And so you can see these are generic. So if by creating level 2, we created an exception for the architect. So you can see, generally speaking, the architect in our company is billed at $150 an hour. But they negotiated a special rate for this project, and so we set up an exception at level 2 for that project, and labor class architect, the billing rate is $100. So that's, you think of the higher the level number, the larger the level number is, that's the more general rate, and then everything below it is considered an exception to the general rate. Now, if it had gone through the employee level, the project level, and the labor class level and didn't find anything, it would have gone to the default level and multiplied it by 125. We have to be very careful. You want to be very careful in setting up a default rate, especially for labor and things like that. If you think about what can happen if you set up this default rate, then that will be the rate that it charges. But let's say if you don't have a default rate defined, then it's forcing it to go through all the levels, and you will actually get your correct rate instead of, let's say someone forgot to set up the rate for whatever scenario you have. It's going to go through all the levels that exist, and if it doesn't find it, it's just going to take the default rate. So you can end up with some inaccurate billing rates with that default just because someone missed setting up the rate. If a rate doesn't exist in the levels, then when Allocator runs, you will get an error on the report that says rate not found. So it's like a red flag that'll come up, and then you can go back and find what billing rate was missed and add it in and run Allocator again, and it will calculate it correctly. So it's better to be careful on those default rates because you don't want to accidentally get billing rates that you're not expecting. Okay, so moving on to my materials rate. I have this one, I only have one level, and it's account category. So based on which account has been charged is how it's going to bill. I could set up project rates and stuff like that, but generically speaking, I'm just billing 10% above cost for my materials, and then I also have travel is 1 times the amount. Now in this instance, I could actually remove travel. It's okay usually on this kind of thing to have a default rate of 1, because that may be the most common rate that you'll be using. In this instance though, so materials is the criteria. So because it's posted to materials, it'll go through and compare the effective rate here to the date of my transaction and take the amount times 1.1. And the same thing will happen with my my travel as well. So we said for travel, use the X rate type, just like this, and multiply the amount that you find times whatever rate exists. And so in this instance, travel is 100% a pass-through, and I can just multiply it times 1 times the amount. So that's how we identify and maintain rates. This will be the screen that you are most often in and will be maintaining, because obviously your billing rates are changing and increasing all the time. Now the interesting thing that we can do with this as well is we can have a history of our billing rates then. So let's say later on we can, for project 11, we've negotiated a higher rate. So now for architect for project 11 is 120. But, oops, I want to make this for 01/01/98. So at the beginning of the next year, my billing rate has gone up to 120. So the system, depending on when you're running Allocator, it compares the transaction date to your effective date, and it can determine which rate it's supposed to use based on your transaction date. So let's look and see where we are as far as setup goes. We've discussed what the rate type definition is. We've also reviewed allocation method setup quite a bit. We've also entered multi-level rate entry. So let's talk about allocation rate table. An allocation rate table is fairly straightforward in that when you do multi-level rate entry here, so I look here at my rates, and when you look at these rates, I only have 3 levels. But let's say your business models change or something is different, and now you want to charge for a different scenario. So with allocation rate table definition, we can define what items show up in that drop down for the rate levels. So let's go and look at this. So I have, if I go to rate table definition, I pull up TM, and then I choose L, because that's my levels. So you can see that my first level is employee, my second level is project, and my first project and labor class, my third level is labor class. So if I had a different scenario, let's say I wanted to do it off of the task, which most likely the task would be maybe before or after. I usually advocate when setting up rate tables that we put blanks in between. So if I put task here, I can set up this rate level, and if I save this and I go back to multi-level rate entry, and I choose L, we'll notice that task is now in the drop down. So the way you change this drop down is through rate table definition. Now, I typically like to have some space between these levels, because even if this is level 3 and level 6, it doesn't care that 4 and 5 are not defined. And this gives me some flexibility. So usually I'll start at level 2 and maybe put one at level 4, level 6. That way, if criteria changes and I need to add a different kind of scenario, I can embed it between. If I have these rate tables already set up, then I'd have to go delete out my rates and move them so that I could put them in the right order. It's just a little easier maintenance. It's not terrible if I ended up with a rate table in the middle here, but it's just a little extra work I have to do to move my rates around. So this table is where we define our rates. Now, the last component that we have to understand related to setup is the rate table is where we define how our rates show up in multi-level rate entry. But how do we get the choice of project or task or labor class to even choose in the rate table definition? So that's the last component we need to look at to set up these rate tables. So when I F3 here, this list is pulling from another setup screen. And that setup screen is called Alloc Key Definition. And this is rarely a screen that you would use, but we want to make sure you understand the capability in case you have scenarios that, that exist for your company. So let's pull up, let's look at labor class to start with. So I have my labor class is my key, and if I go over to rate table definition, labor class is one of the choices in the list, and that's pulling, so LABC right here is pulling directly from this setup table. Now if we tell it, go base your rate on the labor class, the system says, okay, what is a labor class and how do I find it? That's what this screen is intended to do. So labor class, we just put the description, tell how long the field is. Then we want to say, well, when I go to enter my multi-level rate entry, and I come here, and I choose labor rates, and then I have labor class as a choice. If I hit F3, how do I know which list to present to the user when they hit F3? So that's where this setup screen comes into play. So here I'm telling it, how am I going to validate it? So when I hit F3, what screen or what table am I going to go find, whatever field I'm looking for. So there's certain validations that we can do based on already existing data in the table, such as a customer, vendor, things like that. So that's what we're going to do here. The labor class is a code file. Remember, we've been maintaining those code files in Project Controller Setup. So if we come over here and we do code file maintenance, LABC was a code file. So then when I'm validating or trying to find a possible value list, I want that possible value list to come over to this list that exists here and display this for the user. Okay, so that's what we're trying to accomplish. So I'm saying, okay, for validation purposes and for the possible value list, are you going to use a code file, which I just showed you, or are you going to use a field class? And a field class is just a field in the database that already exists and has a possible value list. So when you set up all your customers, there's a list of customer IDs, things like that. The most common ones we'd use would be project and labor class. Or I can hard-code a value in. Do I want 1, 2, 3, ABC to show up, or do we not want any validation? So that's kind of where we're headed. This is just for the PV list and validation. Now the second piece is we have to tell it where to go find the record. So all of Allocator is going, and this is where things get a little confusing, but the transaction table is the PJ, is the project transaction screen that we are here. So this is the transaction table. So every time a record is posted to project, it will update a transaction table, and that's called the project transaction table. So whether it comes from AP or GL or AR, if it flows over to project, it's going to go into the project transaction table. Then when Allocator runs, it also creates transactions into the project transaction table. This is a source record here. So it's saying when I run Allocator and I'm looking for a place where the labor, it tells me what the labor class is. So over here under labor, my labor class is ARC. So when Allocator runs, it says, well, where do I go find ARC so that I can give it a rate? And so this table, this list is broken down into multiple things. For right now, all we care about is that we go find it in the transaction table, and we tell it to go find the labor class. And so we can tell it to go find the employee, we can go tell it to find the project, depending on what key we're looking for. But in this case, we're looking for the labor class. So if we go here and we pull up project, the same concept. We're saying go find our project, because that was one of the keys we were using. And the project is a key field we've already created in our project table. And go look for the project that the transaction was charged to. Okay, so that's just a lot of information that you hopefully will never have to do or maintain. But the point is, if you've added some kind of field to your transactions that's unique to your company, that's a field that you're tracking data to, whether it's inventory ID or warehouse location, things like that. If it's stored with the transaction line on the project transaction record, then a lot of times we can run Allocator and point to that record to get the rate. Sometimes we can't. It's just a learning process with your company and understanding it to configure the system to match. Okay, so rate type, allocation method, allocation key definition, and the rate table. So we've covered all of these, and these run through the allocation processor to generate your project transactions and your GL journal entry transactions. Now I want to take a minute and show you what happens after you run Allocator. So I'm going to go back to Analyzer. I'm going to get out of a couple of these things. I want to take you to Analyzer, and after we ran our Allocator processor, and so now we should have the transactions we were looking for related to my my project. So I'm going to look at this by job, choose my project. I am in the wrong company, so that would always help. Let me change companies here. Back into company 60. Okay, and come back to project, and then we're going to look at Analyzer. And now I can choose project, and I'm going to choose project 11. And I'm going to do multi-project view. So let's recap what Allocator was supposed to do. It was supposed to take my costs, and it's supposed to create billing lines to unbilled work performed, unbilled revenue, unbilled work or expenses, unbilled revenue expenses. So let's look and see what we've got. Here's unbilled revenue. So this was not here before I ran Allocator. Prior to running Allocator, all I had was labor, subcontract, materials, and travel. These were the 4 items we had before we ran Allocator. Then we ran Allocator, and we've got unbilled revenue and unbilled expense revenue. So we're getting closer. We want eventually revenue and revenue recovery, but we don't have that yet because that's going to be created by billing. So here I have unbilled revenue and unbilled revenue recovery. I should also have unbilled AR or unbilled AR somewhere too. I don't see that. But that's because right now I'm only showing my revenue and expense accounts. Unbilled AR is an asset account. So if I change my view to all, now my asset accounts show up as well. Sure enough, there I have unbilled AR expenses, 800, unbilled AR work performed, 4750. That matches and goes along with my unbilled revenue and my unbilled expense revenue. You'll notice that it's a little different on project costs than it is on general ledger, because when we look at general ledger, we usually see debits and credits and positives and negatives. Project, when it posts, it does it a little differently in that if it's a revenue account and it's posting a revenue value to it, it will always show as a positive number. The same with the expenses. If it's posting a positive amount to it, it will always show as positive on your display. So this is why I have positives instead of negatives and positives that we might normally see. If I drill down on this 4750, you'll see the 2 line items that contribute to that is Zoe Clark, $4,000, and $750 for my vendor costs that came through as well. And why do I have that level of detail? Hopefully we remember. We have that level of detail because of my allocation method setup. I told it to post in detail, right? So Allocator here, if I go to TM and I look at the labor line and I put it in form view, I'm posting in full detail and I'm including the units. So that's why I'm getting that level of detail from my line that was created by Allocator. I'm going to remove this unbilled work performed, and I'm just going to display all the transactions I have so far on my job. And I'm going to dump them to Excel to make it a little easier to review. So here I have bill item and PO number. I don't really, there's nothing in those because they didn't come from inventory, so I'm going to take those out. You'll see I have comments. These are the comments from the time card. This is the vendor information here. My employee ID is here as well. If I scroll to the right, I can see a couple of key things. My bill status right now is blank. That means I haven't billed any of them. Once I bill them, we'll see a B come into these lines. I also have a reference number here. This reference number, 109 and 108. These are the AP voucher reference numbers. If I would go back to my voucher batch, this would be the reference number. So it's interesting because here I can get all the way back to where this record was created because I can tell it created from a voucher. See that? Batch type voucher. So if I come over to accounts payable and I pull up my voucher and adjustment entry. Okay, before I move on, let's see what it says. So it's a voucher batch, and it's batch number 134, batch 134. So if I go open up batch 134, and then over here it says reference number 109 to Prosware. Okay, so let me find 109 in here. 109, there it is. So I can find all the way back to my source document, my transaction for $600. That was my AP record. And correspondingly, I have a voucher for my materials in that same batch, reference number 108, that also went to that project. So if I pull it up here and I look at 108, sure enough, that's my material purchase as well. So we should be able to track back to the source record regardless. So let's look here. I'm going to sort by, I have these two voucher records. Okay. Now I have some other batch types in here as well. I have my labor records, so let's look at those. The labor record we've referenced before. That's that $800 that came from the time card. Perfect. Now I have T&E, which was my expense report. So that's my my travel and expense record. That came through. So that's my $500 units for $250. But I got these additional records that are created by ALLC. So this ALLC means it was created by Allocator. And you'll notice I got the same information that I've been looking at before. If I scroll to the right, I'm going to delete this line number because it's not that critical to our understanding. And I'm going to get rid of the inventory IDs because again they didn't come from inventory. So now I have, for this record, I have unbilled work performed, unbilled revenue, and so these are the same items I was seeing in my drill down. So for Zoe Clark, hers went to unbilled work performed and unbilled revenue. And I have for her mileage, same thing, unbilled expenses, unbilled expense revenue. You can see here, this field is very important. If it was created by Allocator, it will have an X in this alloc flag column. Now, let me have my filter here. Let me clear out the allocation. Now, the other thing that I can tell is if it was allocated already, it will have an alloc flag of A. So I can see all these ones that have an A. These are ones that Allocator has already allocated. If they don't have an A and they're supposed to be allocated, then you'll need to run Allocator. So you can easily tell what started from before Allocator and what was created by Allocator by using this transaction detail inquiry screen. It's very valuable. It's so helpful in finding all your data and understanding the records that are on your reports. Okay. Now the next topic we want to discuss is indirect rate calculator. If you don't understand indirect rate calculator, we talked about it originally that your transactions are posted throughout your month on the financial side. So we'll have payroll costs, time off costs, we'll have rent, building, maintenance costs, all these things. So these are your actual costs that are accumulating in your general ledger. And then we would like to know how those apply to our project costs. We don't want to be surprised at how much our actual costs are compared to our provisional. So especially in government contracting, the government approves a provisional rate for you, and that's how you apply those costs throughout the year to your project. But we know that those provisional rates are not really the rates that you're incurring this year based on your costs that are happening month to month. So with indirect rate calculator, we can say, well, we know these are provisionals on the project side, but we also want to have a better understanding of how our actuals are tracking against those provisionals that we thought we would have. So indirect rate calculator is the mechanism where we can gain insight and visibility into those rates. And because it comes from GL, we have to use a process that references data that is in general ledger. So let's look at, we're going to change companies for a moment, and because I have a database that has, let me just go here. I'm going to do close company, find database, and then I'll choose I'm going to choose one of my databases in another system here. And it's configured specifically to include indirect rate calculator. Okay, so I'm in Contoso Business Systems. And I want to, in this instance, we want to take indirect rates that have been generated in project or in GL. So in general ledger, if you aren't familiar with it, we have the ability to set up allocation groups in general ledger. And these allocation groups typically are used to actually post records. Let's say we have rent and we want to take that rent and we want to disperse it across multiple departments based on square footage or something like that. That's typically how we'd use this screen. But in this instance, we are going to create a different allocation method. For our fringe and our overhead and our G&A. So here's an example, and it gets more complicated. And if you work with government contracting, this will make sense a little bit more. But basically, we have a basis amount that we want to generate our fringe off of. So generally speaking, our fringe is based on labor. And depending on the type of indirect rate cost you would have, fringe is usually based on labor, and then overhead is based on the combination of fringe and labor, and possibly other costs as well, like subs or whatever it might be. And then our G&A is based off of fringe, labor, overhead, and G&A. So in the GL allocation group, we can identify the costs that contribute to these calculations. So here we have where we can define our basis, in other words, where are our fringe costs being collected to. And so they're primarily collected in the 6,000 accounts. And then we can tell it that we want to divide it into these calculations that we have below. And these are basis accounts as well. So these combination of items formulate how the indirects are calculated. So we can identify per company and individual installations, implementations, what values will be calculated for your company so that the proper indirect rates can be generated. Once the allocation method is set up, we can run indirect rate calculator, and we can run a process where we run this per month, and when it runs, it calculates the calculations based on what has been posted to General Ledger. So this is an example of where it goes and finds all your fringe costs, accumulates them, and then it identifies your basis accounts, and then it'll come up with the rate. So my fringe rate in this instance is 17%. And so this rate then is generated, and then Allocator, after the rate is calculated, Allocator will create a secondary posting. After the rate is calculated, Allocator will then pick up those rates, and it'll show on your job summary report when you run it for the project. It doesn't post it to the project, but it's available to be seen and reviewed on the job summary report. So indirect rate calculator as a summary is used for companies that need to show those actual costs on the job summary report. It uses your current general ledger group allocation groups, and it will be the last process you run before you close project. So here's an example of the report. And then under indirect rate calculator, we can look at the combination of items that contribute to calculating this information. So we have our GL allocation groups, we have our project allocation methods, and then the account categories obviously contribute as well to determine what accounts are being included. Then when we run the report, the indirect rate calculator generates a statement of indirect expenses, but we also get reporting information on the job summary report. So if we, also I want to look at a couple things related to Allocator and how it ties back to your projects. So even though you set up the allocation rates and allocation methods, we have to link our allocation methods to our projects. So if I go back to project controller and project maintenance, I can choose my project, and I'm in a different company right now, so my project list looks a little different than it did originally, but conceptually it's the same. And then I can come over here and I link it to my allocation method. So back to what we were talking about before, if we go to Allocator, allocation method setup, I want to link my T&M allocation method to my project. So when I come back over to the project, the allocation method is defined here. And then I also need to identify my rate table. And the rate table is where we set up all those different rates that we were talking about in multi-level rate entry. In this one, we have GSA as the rate table. So that's the rate table in the other company we were looking at. It was TM, but we would put this here. So it knows to go find those multiple levels of rates with this table, and this is the allocation method it will use to calculate it. So when we run Allocator, it only looks at projects that have allocation methods associated with them. So if we leave this project ID blank and we leave everything else blank, there's no filter that happens at the end of the month when we run Allocator, and it would generate for any projects that have an allocation method associated with them. I want to take a couple minutes and talk about auto allocation. And auto allocation is a way that we can process transactions from at the moment the transaction is created. So when we approve and post the time card through time review and approval, immediately we can have it run Allocator and generate the unbilled AR and unbilled revenue if you want. Or you can run Allocator at the end of the month and control when those unbilled AR and unbilled revenue hit your general ledger a little more carefully, because it only occurs when you run Allocator. So we can run Allocator manually through the allocation processor screen, or we can choose to turn auto allocation on, and that means every time a batch is processed, whether it's an AP, GL, an expense report, or a time card, once that process is finished, it will kick in Allocator and generate the records automatically. So let's look and see how we can turn on auto allocation. That's one of the setups we skipped in the project controller setup screen when we reviewed that screen. If we go to the PC options and setup tab, we have some choices here related to postings. So we can recap our GL posting. So once it goes to GL, what's the level of detail it includes? I can also choose to bypass zero posting. So sometimes we have instances where we enter a rate that results in a zero posting for Allocator, which is fine, meaning we don't want to bill it, but we don't really want it to create a posting for it either. So we can check this box, and if the result of Allocator is zero, no postings will occur. We can turn on auto allocation by checking the selected by batch box. And then the last step is to auto start allocations. So this is just saying every time a batch is processed, the selection by batch checkbox says every time a batch is processed, that selected batch will run through Allocator on its own, and it will process immediately, and it will automatically start when the batch is finished processing. So as soon as the AP document's released, auto allocation will kick in. As soon as the time card's released, auto allocation turns on. Some of the reasons we would want to do this is because if you have large amount of calculations related to Allocator, processing time can increase or can be lengthy depending on how many transactions you have, how complex your allocation methods are, those type of things, how much you're trying to do at one time. So sometimes we turn on auto allocation to offload those processes to be spread across the month. Other reasons would be you possibly really want to know what your unbilled AR and unbilled revenue is immediately as the transaction is processed. So it makes sense to have auto allocation turned on then as well. So some really valid reasons to have it on. The main reason to not have it turned on is because you want more control over when those calculations occur and when those postings hit your financials. Let's review what we learned with Allocator. We learned how Allocator relates to our billings. We also got a better understanding of different allocation methods depending on the project type, such as time and materials, cost plus, fixed price. We also reviewed the setup and workflow related to allocations and how we can choose different postings, whether it's unbilled AR or unbilled revenue or revenue and unbilled revenue. And we also learned a little bit more about Indirect Rate Calculator and how that works related to our projects. This concludes Module 4, Allocator. In the next session, we will discuss flexible billings for Module 5.